April 4th, 2018. And this is Jeanne Williams, and we're in her home in Portal. So, Jeanne, I always like to find out first if you remember when you first came to Portal.
I don't remember the exact year, except it would have been probably around 73, 74, something like that. I was living in Tucson and came down with the Tucson Audubon Society, and we stayed a few days, and I met Sally Spofford, who was campaigning to have even flatland foreigners write letters to the Game and Fish Commission asking that this be more or less a sanctuary, no trapping or hunting within the confines of the canyon. And I did write a letter when I got home, and I had her letter thanking me. I didn't realize that years later she would be my beloved neighbor until she died. But then I came down with the Southern Arizona Hiking Club, and we hiked around for several days and stayed at Cave Creek Ranch, which was under very different management at the time. And I thought it was such a beautiful place, but I didn't realize that it was possible to buy land here and live here. I just thought that the ranches and the existing people were it and no room for anyone new. So I never considered that I might be able to live here. And then I came back in, I think it was about 75, maybe 77. I was chaperoning a group of high school girls on a 4-day backpack beginning up at Rustler Park, going along the Crest Trail and coming down from Burro Spring and down into the canyon. And it was November. There was snow on the ground up along the trail, and I realized then how very treacherous the footing could be with the snow on top of the leaves that had fallen recently. Very, very tricky footing. And but that was a wonderful experience. And when we came down along the creek, the maple leaves had fallen into the water, so they were floating in the water, and then they were reflected again from up above, and it was just gorgeous. So after I left Tucson, I bounced around a while, but finally I met my husband, who died some years ago, on a birding trip in Mexico. And he said, why didn't I come visit that fall down here? And I already had been here and knew how lovely it was. So I did come down and stayed a few months that fall.
And what was his name?
Bob Morse, right. Robert Morse. Yes. He was quite a birder, and he also, at the time I met him, was a seasonal firefighter, summer worker for the forest. Quite a number of people did that. They would be hired for the summer and then cut loose in the fall. That way the forest was able not to pay benefits or anything like that. And they do that to this day, unfortunately. Yeah, that's right. But anyway, we were married a year later up in Prescott, but Bob didn't much like the monoculture where I lived up at Pine. I'd bought a place under the Mogollon Rim. Very pretty, but lots of pines and very monotonous when you got used to it. And it was cool in the summer, I'll say that for it. And it was scenically beautiful, but not like this, not varied. This place reminds me a good deal of another of my, previously my most favorite place in the world. It was the Big Bend in Texas. Well, This has some similarities to the wooded part of the Big Bend, but this is truly more beautiful, I think. And I have never been sorry that I came here. Bob and I came here in 81 and rented for a year and a half or two and bought this place from Alden Hayes. Uh, Bought it in 82, moved in that fall. Alden had meanwhile been building an adobe house where Reen and Tony now live. But he wanted out of here. I remember that he said, now his wife had suffered a stroke and a heart attack when he was retiring from the Park Service as an archaeologist. And that was after he had gone broke trying to raise cattle here, 53, 54, 55, hauling both water and feed for cattle, tried to keep them alive out at what John Hands called a desperation ranch. And it really was desperation for Alden. And that now is belongs to Myrtle and Red Green, a Young, but she was a Bagwell. She was of the Bagwell family that had quite a few people around here at one time. So Alden went back to being an archaeologist, which was his real profession. And then when they retired, he brought Gretchen here, even though she was wheelchair bound and was never able to walk independently or even communicate very much. But he took beautiful and loving care of her for the rest of her life. She died about a year before he completed the house up there. And he told me one night in the post office that he was putting the house on the market the next day and told me what he was asking. He said, it may not be worth that, but I can get it, and I have 10 people lined up who want it. So come over tonight, and if you want it, you can have it, but I'm not haggling. So we came over and looked at it, and I do wish there had been Vegas, that it had been a little more southwestern, but I did love the tile, and the setup was good. My writing room's at the very back there, and Bob could reign supreme up here, and it worked out well for people who were both pursuing their interest. And so we didn't haggle, we bought it, and we're glad to get it, and I have never been sorry. So that was 82 when we moved in here. Delane and Renee had just finished building their first solar house. I'm sure Delane told you about it.
Yeah.
And they had, I think it took them 2 or 3 years to get it built. But they were already here. And right before we came, they had completed the EMT course and were among the first EMTs to take the course offered over in Rodeo. And it was not long till they were the only ones left standing because other people didn't certify, and they were left like that. And so I think it was about 85 or 86, and we had a program on the EMT program, and with a guy who was our future instructor, and a number of us signed up and took it. So then Delane and Renee were not quite out on a limb so much.
What was life like when you moved in here? I think you were really involved in the hiking group.
Well, the hiking group was not as large as it is now, I think. There were about, it varied, 8 to 12 of us usually. It was originally and all woman, no men allowed.
I didn't
And
know that.
well, that was because Audrey Miller and Sandy Urban, who was then Sandy Hayes, married to Eric Hayes, they were the ones who began it. They said, wouldn't it be fun to get together and just hike? And no guys. So, so they invited me to join, and I did. And Mary Winkler and Joyce Schatz and a number of others. Most of them are gone now, like Rosemary. We had a lot of good hikes. We kind of got stuck on the top of a mountain, not able to get down a few times, but we always did get down. Nobody, we didn't have any, as I can recall, any really terribly serious injuries then, except I did injure my ankle, which is a lasting legacy from those days.
Did you go every week?
We went every week, and we went on Thursdays, and that was my big day out because I wrote relentlessly the rest of the time, every day, and so the only day I took off was hiking day. And so that was, well, Alden said the hiking, oh yes, after he had not retired at the time we were, yeah, he had, but he was busy. I don't remember now when he began hiking with us. Maybe it was after he married Karen. They met on a safari in Africa, and she liked to take photographs, so she'd carry a lot of camera gear on the hikes, and then drag home lots of rocks. But he was the first man to penetrate the no man curtain. But Mary Sue Vassar's son did hike with us, and he's now married to the director of the, not the director, but the scientist in residence, I believe she is called, Michelle Lannon. He's married to her, and they were the heroes of the recent fire scare here just next door to me.
Yeah.
They saw it and it called for help and put out the fire.
Yeah.
So that was the legacy. He used to hike with the ladies group.
He must have been
We
pretty-
did allow grandchildren who were visiting to hike with us. Audrey's grandson hiked with us some, and Bob Addison's grown up and in his 50s. Bob Addison's grandson hiked with us when he was 13, 14. But we had some wonderful hikes.
Do
and
you have any favorite hikes from that era, that time, that you remember well, or places that you enjoyed the most? Or
oh, I was very fond of Hoos Canyon, and I liked the road up at Long Park, up there where you overlook the canyon looking out and going on around. Whitetail was interesting, and the cave up there and the narrows that are hard to get across. More than one hiker has met with grief falling in and breaking legs and things like that. But we did Price Canyon. Also, something we did that I don't think is done anymore now. We would camp out overnight, like up at Rustler Park or here or there. We'd take our tents or sleep in vehicles, and would stay all night and get in 2 days hikes for one.
Nice.
But
they don't do that today that I know of. Yeah.
I don't believe they do, but they do some very strenuous hikes.
Yeah.
And Carol Simon, when she was on vacation or the year they were on sabbatical, she always hiked with the group back then. And of course now she's the backbone that keeps the group headed out. Mm-hmm. And Don Wadsworth was also, of course, he was a good deal later than our all ladies.
Yeah, I love that story. I've never heard that.
Yeah,
So,
that disappeared, and we became well, a free for all, I guess.
a co-ed group.
But I thought it was more fun when we had the men along,
Yeah.
and so that it all worked out.
Now, when you first moved down here, you moved and you got married. You lived here full time from then on. Is that correct? You lived here full time?
Well, yes, we lived. I did. I didn't get rid of my house up at Pine for several years, but we didn't go up there. I did have to travel quite a bit for my book research. I made 2 trips to Russia, one out to Lake Baikal and Khabarovsk on the Chinese border, which was as far as you could go then. Now you can go all the way to Vladivostok, but you couldn't in those days. I went first in the time of Gorbachev, and then the last trip I took was Yeltsin had just become the new president. So I was there two different times, but both times were in a more thawed time than it had been previously. And one was a 13 cities trip, which was interesting, but what I really loved was it was the first Sierra Club trip to Siberia, and I really enjoyed that. There were only 6 of us, and we did did some wild traveling, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad still runs out there, the great engineering feat of those Tsarist days, really. But, and of course, Norway and England pretty often, and places where my books are set. I have never written a book where I had not been to the place. Like when I wrote The Cave Dreamers, I went to, well, first to Reno, Nevada to research in their excellent Basque collection, and then to Bilbao, and I had introductions from a very sweet part Basque girl that I met in Reno, and she had been over visiting her relatives, and she gave me introductions to them. So that made all the difference in getting around to see places there. And I did get to visit the sites that I used in the book, and that was, that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed, I could usually get one long book and one short book out of a trip. So yeah, but I never liked to be gone very long, and when I would leave the canyon, I would be watching in the rear view mirror as I headed for Tucson and the airport, and it was wonderful to come back in sight of the mountains again, because this is where I wanted to be. I never wanted to live anywhere else.
Even with all your travels, you were never tempted to...
I was tempted with Alaska. It was very frontier and kind of wild edges, lots of wildlife, very beautiful in July when I was there.
Yeah.
But when we went up to Glacier Bay, and I really did like the feeling of a frontier and a place that was still wild around the edges. It did appeal to me a lot, but then they started talking about the long nights, and I knew I couldn't stand that. Being isolated by the snow and ice, I don't think that would have bothered me too much, but the dark would have really gotten to me.
Yeah.
So no.
Yeah.
That was a a flirtation, you might say, but it didn't last very long.
Can you describe a little bit about what you had the hiking group and what the maybe social scene was, or what Portal was like when you first moved here? Any memories of?
There were not nearly as many people as we have now.
Mhm.
Bob knew the birding folks like Bert and Millie, who their place was bought by Elaine and Dave now own it, but Squires bought it from Bert and Millie, who were old friends of theirs,
Yeah.
and Bert and Millie lived there, and then Spoff and Sally lived down here. Well, nobody lives there now. That's
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah.
It
It's
is the
empty.
house right adjacent to Cave Creek
Creek
Ranch.
Yeah.
They have common borders,
Yeah.
but it was bought by a man who now lives in Tucson.
Yeah.
He has never lived here,
Yeah.
and Sally wanted that to be a perpetual bird refuge and left those were her directions and her wish. But unfortunately, there was a whole lot of controversy and legal trouble about it.
Okay.
But she had wanted it to be a bird refuge in perpetuity and had left directions and instructions for that. But instead, it was put up for sale. Now, down by the library, there is a little sanctuary
Yeah.
that is, I think, the plaque reads something like Sally Spofford Bird Refuge or something to that effect. And some of the feeders from her place were taken up there and hang still there. But it is one of the sad things, really, that Dave Jasper did continue feeding over at his former place, kind of in Sally's memory. And of course, he and Elaine have feeders at their current home, too. But she had birders from all over the world signed into her address book, and birding groups. She did limit them to 30 at a time because otherwise there could be 2 or 3 buses there at one time. It still is listed in a number of bird books as as if it were operating, but it's not. Even now, all these years later, people still come up here and wonder if this is the Spoffords, and uh, and I explain that that is no longer
Yeah. It
relevant.
is very sad.
It is sad.
Yeah. What? So there's were fewer people. Did downtown Portal look the same as it is now? Have there been many changes?
Well, yes, as I say, now the portal store. Not in my time, but in Alden's time, there were the two stores were open. The one where it's now, it was Henry Beimler's law office for a while, but before that was a grocery store and gas station, and then Cata Corner was the Portal store, which was at that time run way back, was run by the Gordon Newmans, and he sort of began Cave Creek Ranch as a camp out fishing camp for fishermen. He liked to fish, so he left his wife to run the store, and she was also a nurse who took care of the school kids who fell out of the trees and did a little midwifing and this and that. I guess she was a lovely woman. She was dead before I came, but Gordon just kind of had a good time down there fishing and
Sounds
hunting.
like she was doing the work and he was having fun.
Yeah, well, I guess it worked. But he did put in some cabins there, and there was a high school for a little while across the creek in one of the cabins. One year, Finley Richards went to high school the one year there, and but it only lasted, I think, a year, or possibly a year and a half. And of course our sweet little portal school closed in, I believe, was it about 74, or it might have been a little later. It was around about then, because Sheila Clark, I think, was in the last graduating 8th grade class from here. They phased it out kind of gradually. Ted Troller could tell you about that. He was on the school board. There were getting to be fewer and fewer kids. I think they were down to like maybe 6 or 7, and so they met the school board met with the people from San Simon, and so it was agreed that the Portal kids would gradually, they would keep the young ones here for a little longer and send the older ones up there, and then they phased them all out, and all of the kids went to San Simon. And so that was the end of the Portal School. However, it had a stirring rebirth when Myrtle Craft began showing old, well, she did open a library there, sort of. I don't believe that at that time we got any help from the county or anything. It was strictly a volunteer thing. But she would get old Marx Brothers and somebody in Hardy and...
Oh, Laurel and Hardy.
Yes, those old
Films.
rickety films, and show them once a week. And
Was this in the evening, like a Friday night?
it
or-
was in the evening.
Oh,
and-
what a great idea.
And there were some books, and Myrtle lived up on top of the hill above the above the Portal store, on the other side of the creek. Myrtle and Ted, they were both from the East. He was a professor of, I think, literature. I don't believe biology. He was a different.
Unusual around here.
Yeah, and she had wrangled horses over at the Faraway Ranch for a while, and that evidently is how they met. He was on vacation and met her. And there's an amusing story about the Faraway by Ruth Morse, no relation to my husband, but she was the assistant director down at the research station for quite a long time during Vince Ross time. And she, I believe, is still living over at Pierce Sunsites over in that area.
Oh, I
She
should
has
check
been
it out.
back over here a time or two. But she wrote a real entertaining story about Miss Lillian, the blind lady who ran the Faraway at that time. Really a woman of iron. And her cowboys, and how Myrtle got along with them, which we won't go into here. So
So the library, she got the library started.
she got the
had
library
movies.
going, and then they did begin, the county, I guess the county did get involved, the county library, and I think they began to send books, and they gave her a small stipend, which she spent on stuff for the library. We didn't really have a, the you might say head librarian would get a small monthly allowance or stipend or whatever you want to call it. But the first time they really paid anybody was when Todd Malone did it, and he was succeeded by Kathleen. But he was our first paid librarian. And of course, the library has changed a lot. It's been renovated and cleaned up, and but it was built as it was an adobe built in 1930, and the what is now the post office was one of the. There were two. There there was a school that burned. I think the first school in Portal was like 1907, something like that. It was taught by Ola Chenoweth, and she was married, though, to somebody else, a martyr, I think. Anyhow, she opened the school and taught a few. In fact, the teachers then, if you follow their progress, they tended to teach here and Hilltop and Paradise and Lone Oak over by Rodeo, and they moved around quite a bit. And so that's, I know that in her students, I think that she had 4, maybe more than that, Brazilian kids who were the children of Howard Chenoweth, who had married a Brazilian lady down there. When she died, he came back and put all these kids in school. And they spoke Portuguese, not Spanish, so that added another wrinkle to the school system. But it was in a smaller building, which did burn down at some point. And then they built the adobe in 1930 because Dorothy, she was Gus Chenoweth's granddaughter. Dorothy Jessie was her married name, and she's buried in Paradise with her immediate family.
Well, I was going to ask you about the teacherage. If you
Oh,
could
the
say
teacherage.
a history
Well,
of that building.
I haven't been able. I've asked the Vossers who rented it for many years, and they would either live in it or their grad students who were down here for a while would. But I don't believe that we have any clear account of when the teacherage was built. But I think it must have been about the time they built the adobe school, which is the present library. But the idea with the teacherage, teachers almost never lived there. Now, like she was Stephen Reed's daughter-in-law. Yeah, she was married to Walter Reed, Mrs. Reed, very much remembered and beloved, and she lived, of course, at home with her husband. She never lived there, and in fact, I don't know if any teacher ever lived in the teacherage. One man who was universally despised and disliked had a kind of a small camper that he parked over there on that platform. And he put bear traps all around it to keep anyone from bothering him at night. He was not very well liked, and I think he spent 1 year here. But the teacherage was usually rented out to provide a little income. And I don't know of any teacher who lived there.
Oh, that's interesting.
When the Toll sisters were kind of renowned, and they built up there where Mary Willie's house is now. They bought an old the claim of this old settler who had homesteaded up there. North of the road, you know where the fire station is. If you followed that road around, you would come to Mary Willie's
Oh, Mary Willie's, yes. Okay.
home.
Yeah.
Yes, the one where Nabokov is supposed to have written. He didn't write all of Lolita. He probably wrote a little. He traveled around the Southwest writing here and there, and he may have written a chapter or two here, but he certainly didn't write the whole book here.
No, but he was here. That was true. Yeah.
He was here. He was a butterfly
Yeah.
chaser and
Yeah.
loved butterflies. But his wife met a rattler on their door one morning, and that was the end of their stay here, or so says folklore. But Ted Troller remembers that he could hear her playing the piano up at his house from the sound floating up from there. And the Toll sisters bought this old mining claim, homestead from this old miner, and they just inherited this shack. Miriam Tolles wrote about coming here when she was, I think, 19, and arrived on the stage for rodeo. The driver dumped her and her companion, an orphan Mexican girl who was going to live with her. A good thing, too. They had each other. They trudged up the mountain in the dark, and the bed was just springs, no mattress, no anything. And they ate some bread and cheese, and they found an old kerosene lamp and fell into bed. They were so tired. But her choices, Miriam Toll's choices, had been she could live with a family that had 6 kids and all kinds of dogs, cats, cows, horses tumbling in and out of their house, or, she could do that, or she could take this place. So she took that place. And, but Elsie, the older sister, became the first woman, the first Arizona woman superintendent of schools. And she was earlier the Cochise County superintendent, and she used to visit every little outlying school in Cochise County. Some of them she had to get off at the bottom of the mountain and walk up, but she made it to all of them. And she later served on the parole board and was quite a woman. Wrote a couple of books about school children in this area. And Miriam is responsible, the younger sister, for that step up in the library. If you have wondered why they have the raised part and the steps going up, that is Miriam. She was a puppeteer out in California, and she wanted to put on marionette shows and also have dramatics for the kids. And so she was here when they were building the adobe, and she, according to Finley Finley Richards, who told me this, she did want that platform, and they put it in at her behest.
Were the Richards living here, Finn and Sally, when you bought
They
your
weren't
place?
when, let's see, yeah, I guess they were here then. They, like Alden, had, they got married after World War I. I think they married in 49, something like that. But Finn was a survivor of the Bataan Death March, and he had a bad back to the end of his life. In fact, in his later days, he suffered such intense pain that the shots, he couldn't get them often enough to really kill the pain. So he endured a great deal of agony in his later years. But he was still an active cattleman. He and Alden had agreed not to run cattle in this area because it was getting so occupied with people. And so they had cattle holdings farther out. Then sold off a lot of the land over that he owned over along there. He sold Renee and Delane their property. So what happened with them is they had begun some cattle, and Sally had been to college and had a teacher's certificate and had taught skill in Tucson and several other places. But the drought that wiped so many people out wiped them out too, and so they went out to Texas, and he worked in the oil fields there until things improved and they came back here. And so when they could, they built the house up there, which Reed Peters bought from Sally, and they lived there until then became so, it was just too difficult. And so they went to St. David and built a replica of this house, only a little bit smaller. And then they moved up to Vale near their son David, and they built an even smaller house. But Finn passed away up there, and Sally decided that her son Michael lives over there near Las Cruces and looks in on her a lot. And you talked to her there.
I talked to her, and
Yes,
when she
yes.
talked about this house, that was their dream home.
It was.
Finn drew on a piece of cardboard or paper, and she was very fond of living here.
It's a beautiful home with the fireplace, and she loved music, and she wanted a baby grand. And after Reed moved in, she was pleased that someone who loved music and would value the house had bought it. She was quite happy about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, they also, oh yes, yeah, another venture they had been involved with. I know that they had to build it after Texas, because we rented the duplex of where Howard and Carol have their house now. While they were still both teaching in Brooklyn, they did buy, because Finn and Sally had, I guess after they came back from Texas, had put in a very fancy gourmet restaurant over there where Maya has the wall around. Well, that was the lodge, and it was the common room and dining room and all for this lodge that they opened, and they served very good, I understand, sirloin and but the problem there was they hired a fancy chef. People would come on the weekends, but how could they couldn't sustain it on just weekend people.
Yeah.
And so that did not work. So, and they were renting the cabins around there, the duplex that Carol and Howard bought, and then the one where Gloria lives now, which Lucy Gunn had for a while, and the one up there where Susan Dalby and Eskel Peterson, where they live, and the Chew's old place, and Maya's place was the original lodge thing. So they sold off all those cabins. And because we rented one of the duplexes for the autumn that I was here the first time. And Carol and Howard were, of course, not here. They were up north. And when they came down here, then when they got within a short time of retirement, well, maybe 4 or 5 years away, knowing the slow pace of construction around here, they engaged Eric Hayes, who was a very good builder, but what he would do is work on one place for a while, and then he'd take those workers to another place, and so we would have 2, 3, even maybe more things going on at the same time, and it took him forever to finish anything. So he did the guest house down here at Sally's, very nice, but it took several years for it to get built. And the only person I ever knew who got Eric to keep a deadline was Sherry Nelson. She and Debbie had the beautiful place across the creek, which they sold, I think, to folks from Houston who were used to floods, and I haven't met them yet, but the Cunninghams will be living there. Well, when this was going to be a rigid foam house where they brought in the whole walls, and they brought them in from Dallas. They bought the stuff up there, and these well, whatever, trucks. Of course, they had to winch the things down, but the problem with this is that the cement flooring had to be no more than, I think it was a 1/4 inch, either an 1/8 or a 1/4 inch. It could not vary more than that.
Right.
And so that was in the contract that Debbie and Sherry made up with Eric, and also Sherry inserted a clause that said if it ran past a certain date, and it gave the date, then Eric would pay double. He would pay her double until it was done, and something like that. It was pretty binding. Anyway, he got through with it, and it was perfect. But that's the only. I think that my husband made a video of that, and I believe I gave it to them. But he made a video of the whole walls being settled down, because they already had the windows cut and the wiring was already in them. It was quite a process. And they then stuccoed it themselves and did the finishing work. Beautiful place. You'd think it was an old Spanish hacienda.
Yes.
Archways, just lovely.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to Eric and his desultory ways. I asked him once, well, Eric, when people ask you when you're going to get through, what do you tell them? He said, oh, I always say 2 weeks. You got to say something. Well, so Howard and Carol had engaged him to add this beautiful, absolutely gorgeous room, which probably has a lot more room than, well, I know it does, than the original. The duplex was just the 2 rooms, two very efficiency apartments, and so this room I know would hold them both, and probably something else, and a beehive fireplace in one end, many windows, just beautiful, and a custom kitchen, fantastic. But the time came and went, and they wanted to come for Thanksgiving, and Eric said, well, you can come, but you'll kind of have to camp out because things aren't finished yet. So time passed, and Howard said, well, that they really were going to be ready to move down here, and they really wanted it done. And Eric finally got through with it, and it is a gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous house. But the building was, construction around here was kind of unique.